given that he's spending a lot of his time travelling around doing these kind of talks, presumably in many cases getting paid quite well for them. Whether we're actually going to see him come back anytime in even the medium term or the long term is a big question.
Boris Johnson has made a surprise appearance overnight at a Conservative conference in Canada, describing Rishi Sunak's plan to ban smoking as absolutely nuts.
When I look at some of the things that we're doing now, I think that are being done in the name of conservatism, I think they're absolutely nuts. We're banning cigars. And what is? I mean, maybe you all think that's a great idea. I just can't see what is the point of banning? Well, the party of Winston Churchill wants to ban. I mean, donnez-moi un break, as they say in Quebec. It's just mad.
That's Boris Johnson speaking as only Boris Johnson would. The former Prime Minister was on stage at that Canada Strong Free Networking Conference in Ottawa. He drew that line between the current Prime Minister's passion project on smoking and the cigar-smoking Winston Churchill to support his argument. He also warned Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump not to abandon support for Ukraine, inciting the memory of Ronald Reagan, saying Putin must not win the Ukraine war. Let's talk to Rachel Cunliffe, the New Statesman's Associate Editor. Hello, Rachel.
Hello.
So we'll come on to Ukraine in a second, but he was very critical of his successor, but one, Rishi Sunak. Isn't there a convention that visiting leading politicians don't take swipes at their home country or their own government or party from overseas?
I imagine it'd be quite difficult to find a convention that Boris Johnson has stuck strictly to throughout his political career. So why it should be any different now he's a former PM, I think is exactly what you'd expect for him to continue to pop up and make comments, sometimes in a way that might be helpful to Sunak. We know that there are suggestions that Boris Johnson might help on the election campaign, but sometimes in a way that is very unhelpful. And this conference that he was at, the type of conservatism conference that he was at in Canada, is one where there is more of an emphasis on libertarianism, on freedoms, on the government staying out of people's business, than the sort of version of conservatism that Rishi Sunak represents here in the UK. So it's a clash of conservative values, but it's also at odds with where British voters are. One of the interesting things about the smoking ban that Rishi Sunak wants to bring in, even though a number in his party don't support it, is that it's one of the few things he's suggesting doing that's actually very popular. Majority of British voters, including a majority of British Conservative voters, support this ban where you phase out cigarettes by increasing the age at which people are allowed to buy them. So it's an interesting clash, both sort of across the Atlantic, but also between the Conservatives in the Conservative Parliamentary Party and voters overall.
Yeah, it does make you wonder. Maybe it makes Rishi Sunak wonder whether it would be a good idea to have Boris Johnson closely in harness during a campaign, given that he's describing his pet project as nuts. Boris Johnson was much more on message on the question of Ukraine, though, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. And that's really interesting because we've now had two former British Prime Ministers go across the Atlantic this week to urge Republicans and send a message to Republicans, particularly to Republicans who are supporters of Donald Trump, that they really do need to support Ukraine and pass that aid, that support bill that is stalled in Congress at the moment. And obviously Boris Johnson has always been very, very strong in his support of Ukraine. One of the things that he did as Prime Minister was be one of the sort of first world leaders to really put that on the global priority list. But I think he was also possibly making a point about the current Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, and how he might be able to achieve things that Cameron has so far struggled with.
Yeah, you do have to wonder what might have happened if Boris Johnson and David Cameron had teamed up on that visit to Washington. Would they have convinced those hardline Republicans to fall in and support Ukraine? Actually, having said that, chances are probably not. Rachel Cunliffe, great to talk to you. Thank you.
This is Boris Johnson, of course, who has once again refused to rule out a return to frontline politics. He was speaking at an event in Washington, D.C. He said he would re-enter public life only if he felt he had something useful to contribute, and he sounded less than impressed at the current state of his party.
When I look at some of the things that we're doing now, I think that are being done in the name of conservatism, I think they're absolutely nuts. And I see my own beloved party, which, as I say, I hope will be shortly infected with the the great, well, not infected, what's
infused,
invigorated, transfused with the Canadians' can-do spirit, and will turn things around in the next few months.
Well, there you are. That's former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He was speaking to students at Georgetown University, Terry.
Yes, that's right. And he's been talking about lots of different issues. So everything from Ukraine to whether Donald Trump might come back, what Trump might do if he were in office again, Obama's record, and talking about US politics. And as you can hear, sort of ranging pretty widely over issues. But when he was asked about whether he would stand again as an MP, he said, "I think it's unlikely in the short term." So obviously, not entirely ruling out doing that in the long term there, but given that he's spending a lot of his time travelling around doing these kind of talks, presumably in many cases getting paid quite well for them, whether we're actually going to see him come back anytime in even the medium term or the long term is a big question.
Yeah, indeed. Terry Stiasny, thank you very much indeed. That's political correspondent Terry Stiasny. You can read more about Boris Johnson's speech in Washington, if you like, in the Times today. Alistair Dauber reports from Washington, quote, "I see my beloved party were banning cigars. What is the point? The party of Winston Churchill wants a ban," he says. He was also asked really how committed he is to democracy, given his decision to prorogue Parliament in 2019, which was later declared unlawful. And he said that at the time, there was an attempt by the UK establishment to frustrate the will of the people over Brexit. So you can read the full report from Alistair Dauber online now.
It is still very unlikely that the Conservatives will regain ground. And according to many election experts, particularly those that I've spoken to this week, they see that whatever happens in May, it is going to be a disastrous result for the Conservative Party, who are likely to lose hundreds of council seats.
Well, and you wonder if it is a bad night for the Conservative Party in the local elections, whether there will be talk of a potential comeback for Boris Johnson, who was asked about this yesterday. What did he say, Tom?
So Boris Johnson was interviewed by a number of students in Washington, and there was talks about many parts of his career. There was, of course, Brexit, what he thought of Donald Trump, but of course, as you say there, whether he would become an MP again. Now, I think Boris Johnson innately would have loved this question, and he could kind of maybe compare in his head to his, obviously, Churchill, who came back as an MP 5 times for different constituencies. Now, Boris Johnson said in the short term this is very unlikely, but did not rule it out in the long term. Now, whether this is a feasible possibility, who knows? The only thing that will definitely really, of course, unlike for someone like Rishi Sunak, this will, of course, cause major problems and headaches within Number 10. They see Boris Johnson, of course, as someone as a major disruptor, someone whose comments on major policy issues, whether it's been Brexit or whether it's been in the smoking ban recently, has, of course, caused major problems within Number 10 and made things more difficult for them. As ever, a former Prime Minister commenting on policy is never a good look for the government. So I think this is at the moment more about attention, but of course Boris still has that magnetic pull with many Tory voters.
Tom, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's Tom Scottson there, political reporter for Politics Home.